and they worked closely with Rome. Rome and them, obviously they had money, and they were heavily involved in the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and they were very accepted by the Romans. Some of the other sects were like the Zealots. We've all heard of them. The Maccabees. They were still around even in the time of Jesus. They were not accepted even by the Jewish community. They were sort of just the crazy radical guys. And another thing I learned was the Diaspora. So the Diaspora are the Jews that had started to move throughout the Roman Empire, the known world. There was an actual established temple in Alexandria, which is important later on. And they started to move away from speaking Hebrew, and they had started mostly speaking Greek. And so when they were translating the Jewish texts, they would be translated into Greek, and that led to the Jewish leadership to say, hey, we need to have a cohesive document that is translated into Greek. So what they did is they got 70 Jewish scholars. This is according to the legend, or the Jewish tradition. They got 70 Jewish scholars together in Alexandria at the big Jewish temple there. And they said, translate the Hebrew text into Greek. And supposedly that translation among all 70 Jewish scholars was word for word. And that became the Septuagint. So the Septuagint is the Old Testament in our faith. But so it was solidified, verified by 70 Jewish scholars. And that's very important because I'm not going to discuss about Jesus' death, but at the time of Jesus' death, Christians would use the Septuagint to go to other Jews because they were considered Jews. Early Christians were considered a sect of Judaism, not a separate religion at the time of Jesus' death and shortly after. They would use the Septuagint to justify the Messiah coming, and they would use that to try to convert other Jewish people into the Christian faith. And so, because of that, an interesting fact too is the Christian word for Christ actually comes from the Septuagint, and it means the anointed one. So the early Christians would use the text of the Septuagint to try to get other Jews to say, look, Christ is mentioned in the Septuagint numerous times as the anointed one, and he has come and saved us. The Jewish leadership quickly saw that Christianity was spreading quickly and throughout the Jewish faith, and they were getting a lot of converts early out of the Jewish religion. And so they came together as a group and retranslated the Septuagint so that the Christians could not use it in their conversion. So it was pretty interesting. And so they just pretty much gave it to the Christians as theirs to keep.
Do you remember when the Septuagint was translated? About 70 BC or something like that? Remember when?
About 200 BC.
200 years before Christ.
Yeah, so the Septuagint was translated.
Another while.
Yeah, it had been around for about 200 years by the time.
Yeah, it doesn't say in the... So, just as a background, when we started coming here, I asked Pastor Philip for some books on the history of the Reformed Presbyterians, because I don't think I'd ever even heard of Reformed Presbyterians before. Pastor Philip came over 3 times to my house and talked to me, and so I was very interested in the background, and like we talked about in men's group yesterday, I'm very interested in knowledge, and so I came to him and said, hey, how can I find some history about the early church, because I had not learned very much. And so he recommended this excellent book. It's called The Story of Christianity by Giusto, Gonzalez, and it's a 2-volume set. It's very thick, it's very heavy, but it's got a lot of information in it. And then also, when we get to the martyrs, I looked at Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is another great resource as well. So after Jesus died and resurrected, the Christians, they started converting and trying to grow their faith and spread the good news, and they were considered Jews. They were not considered Christians at the time. They were considered part of the Jewish community. And that sort of, it's just amazing at God's timing, because at any other time in history before then, it probably wouldn't have spread as quickly. If you think about the Roman Empire at the time of Jesus' death, it stretched all the way from Spain, all the way into Asia Minor, and all the way from North Africa. I tried to draw a map, but I'm even more artist than Pastor Philip. So it turned out poorly.
I'm not that great.
And so, and it spread north all the way to Great Britain. And the most important thing, they had been, a culture for, I think, almost 1,000 years at that time. They had built numerous roads, and if we've all studied history and seen, they had built well-developed roads. The roads are still some roads are still even being used to this day. That's how well the roads were engineered. And they had multiple trade routes. So if you think about at the time of Jesus' death in 30 or 31 AD, by 50 AD, they had established churches in Rome and communities in Rome, and they had spread all the way in throughout the Roman Empire in a few short years, less than 20 years they had spread. And it's interesting to see how God uses the Roman Empire to spread his faith so quickly. And it was an almost unstoppable spread because of the infrastructure that they had developed. And like I said, the early Christians were considered a sect of Judaism. And this is very important, because as we read the New Testament, we see it. We do read, in Acts and other books, we read about the persecutions of the early Christians. They were not persecuted by the Romans. And I thought that up until I started reading this book. They were persecuted by the Jewish community. The Jews were actually the ones that stoned Philip, not the Roman Empire. Hey, Luke! What's up, little buddy? And so a lot of the early martyrs were not martyred by the Romans. They were martyred by the Jews, because they started seeing them as heretics. It wasn't until Nero that Christians were actually officially martyred by the Roman Empire. But early on, they saw themselves as Jews. Even Paul saw himself as a Jew. But the interesting thing about Paul is Paul he also targeted the Gentiles. And that was very important. So as he was converting Jews, and he was converting Gentiles. So, there's a lot of Jews that became Christians during the early times. And then as Paul started getting the Gentiles converted, and started growing. And because the Gentiles were becoming Christians at that time, they're also starting to go to the Jewish temples. Well, they didn't know the Jewish traditions. They weren't circumcised. Yeah, go ahead, Lon. No, go ahead.
This question, were you saying earlier that there are people who became, when Christianity started, it was considered an early Jewish sect, and the people who became Christians in there were considered Jewish?
Yes. So they're looked upon as so it's interesting too, because the Romans, let's see, someone will look up Acts 18.
It's interesting, and this is a few chapters later than in Acts 15, or Acts 18, but in Acts 23, you've got the high priest who's a Sadducee, right? Mm-hmm. And he's, Paul is in the hot seat with him, okay? And so it's interesting what Paul does, because, so the high priest has Paul hit in the face. He makes somebody strike him in the face. And Paul calls him a whitewashed wall, and he says, you're judging me according to the law, but you're striking me contrary to the law. And then the next thing Paul says, he perceives that some of the assembly are Pharisees and some are Sadducees, and he says, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, and it is with respect to the hope of the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial." So what he does is he divides the assembly. But for Paul, Paul identifies himself as a Pharisee because the Pharisees believed in the resurrection. The Sadducees didn't, but they were, like you said, they were the controlling group. They were smaller but more powerful, had more money. They were in league with Rome. But for Paul, it was always about, he believed in the resurrection, and when Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus, now his theology is completed, but he still considered himself a Jew and a Pharisee. So yeah.
Yeah, and Paul was a Jew looking for Christian heretics on the road to Damascus.
Mm-hmm.
So he became converted, and he still saw himself as a Jew, and he was using the Septuagint to show that the Messiah had come as a promise to Israel, and that's why.
Yeah, it's just an interesting historical note that some people who were early Christians were considered Jews, or considered themselves Jews, and it also calls into question what defines a Jew. I mean, in other words, by blood or by faith, obviously, and but then there's the other thing I think maybe you'll get to later, and that is that a lot of Jews at a certain point in history who started converting to Christianity became persecuted and ostracized and cast out of their own families, just because they converted to Christianity. So
Yeah, and so it's like interesting because they would go to the temple, and so if Paul converted a Gentile, they would go to a Jewish temple. And so they were not, well versed in the Jewish. They weren't circumcised. They hadn't done all the things that a Jew's supposed to do to come to faith. And so that started leading to the Jewish leadership to start kicking Christians out of their temple. And so they didn't have a place to worship. And so then that's where they started to get together in small groups on Sunday, which is biblical. It's not just a result of they just picked a random day. It's the day of Jesus' death. They would come together and they would break the bread, and because they already knew the word, they were extremely well versed in the Old Testament and Jesus' death. And Paul was writing them letters, and so they would read the letters. But for the most part, they would just come together in small groups, get together, break the bread, drink the wine, fellowship together, and have a worship service. But as more Gentiles started coming in, the church leadership or the people realized that they needed to have an education portion on Sundays to teach about what was, the Old Testament, Moses, and all the way up into Jesus, because they were like, hey, I love this good news, but they were baby Christians, like we all were at one time. And so all these little small groups, they're all, throughout the Roman Empire, started realizing hey, we need to start having a period of time spent on instruction of the word, and then we'll have a time to break the bread, which is exactly how we worship today. So it's really interesting to see, even after 2,000 years, we talked yesterday in men's group about adding and taking away, or adding to worship. We in this church worship just like they would in the original times. They would come together in a simple dwelling, not a majestic building full of jewels and gold. Come together as a group, as a family, have a period of instruction on the word, which Pastor Philip does for us, and then a time to break the bread. And that was to help grow the knowledge and strength of the community and the faith. So I found that to be really interesting about how that it just sort of just came together. It's like a group of people that were all separate, and they all had the same idea, and it just started going like that. However, the breaking of the bread caused a lot of people to believe that, or allowed the Romans, when they decided to start persecuting us, that it gave them ammunition. So one of the biggest things was they would say that Christians were cannibalistic because we're eating and drinking the blood of Christ. And so, a lot of Romans, they hear that and they're like, yep, those people are evil. And if someone would read Acts 18, 14, 15, I thought it was very interesting because, like we talked about earlier, the Jews were persecuting the Christians. It wasn't the Romans. The Romans actually were like, hey, we don't want anything to do with the Jewish community and enforcing your laws. We've dealt with you guys for so long, and up until the time of Jesus, the Jews were very, they did not want to worship the Roman emperor. They didn't want to give incense, they didn't want to worship their gods, but they were still good citizens of Rome, other than that one specific area. And they would fight. The Maccabees are a famous, some people call them a cult, but they were a very famous sect. They actually rose up against, they're one of the few uprisings. In fact, Jewish people are the only group of people that rose up against Rome and actually got what they wanted. They got the Roman Empire to let them practice their faith for, 170 AD on, or 140 AD?
Yeah. Can I comment on
Yeah.
that? Yeah. So, and I know you want the scripture in just a second. So, a couple of things. So, the Maccabees, Rome had conquered, Israel and the Holy Land and so forth. Actually, this goes back to Babylon, to the 586 BC conquest of Babylon. But Rome actually, inherited that from Babylon, then Persia, then Greece, and then Rome, conquered the Greek Empire of Alexander. That Alexander really expanded. So real quick, or as fast as I can. Alexander the Great forced the entirety of his conquered land, so all the way to India, Spain, and everywhere in between, to embrace the Greek language in order to trade. And so that paved the way for the Septuagint to be written. And so not only Jews could understand it, that were now speaking Greek because of their Greek overlords, okay, but even other cultures beyond them could now start reading the Word of God by the Septuagint translation in 200 BC. In about 167 BC, there was a group of zealous Jews that we call the Maccabees, or the Hashmoneans. Okay, and they fought against Rome for 20-something years, and they achieved independence from Rome in 140 BC. So from 140 BC to 39 BC, Israel was independent. And this actually fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies that a lot of people attribute to 1948. But they were actually fulfilled all the way back before Christ. God did, bring the people back into the land, and they were independent for 100 years. What happened in 39 BC, and sorry for taking so long here, but what happened in 39 BC was the Sadducees got tired of not being in control. So at this point, the Maccabees were still ruling, and the Sadducees got in league with Rome, and they said, if you will help us overthrow this group of priests, okay, the Hashmoneans or the Maccabees, we will basically give you control of Israel again. If we can be priest, you can be king. And so what happened was Rome put Herod the Great, who was actually an Edomite, so a descendant of Esau, on the throne of Israel as a vassal king to Rome. And that's what happened. Now, what's really interesting is that the last Maccabean king was crucified. So just let that sink in. Like, the last Maccabean king was crucified in 39 BC. So when Jesus comes around, there's all this noise about he's going to start an earthly kingdom. He's another one of these that's going to overthrow Rome. And that's what they wanted him to do. But anyway, yeah, it's very interesting stuff.
So long, I came from Catholic background, I'm a kid too, but is there any reason why, like, the Maccabees, like first and second Maccabees from like Catholic Bible is not in like the Protestant?
I have no idea.
I can answer that. The Maccabees, so it has to do with whether a book is divinely inspired and perfect, or whether it's just historical, good history. And there is a lot of good history in the books of the Maccabees, but they're not divinely inspired, and there are internal reasons for that as well. You can tell God's divine stamp is not on those books. There are errors in the books. In other words,
Was it good to still study for the historical stuff?
Yeah.
I think it was determined at the First Nicene back in 300, which we won't talk about today, but they got together and codified the New Testament, and I think they also codified the Septuagint as well.
Well, yes and no. I mean, the Septuagint was embraced even in the Jews, like the Council of Jamnia, I think it's called, in the year 80. of the first century. So there's always an understanding that these books were history, but they weren't scripture. Okay. And the Christians just continued that. So if you look at even in the early church fathers, they don't consider the Maccabees to be inspired. There are other issues. It's a long discussion, but the long and short of it is it's pretty good history, but not inspired.
So like all throughout like the Roman, like we have historical documents from the Roman Empire, they verify that the Romans would allow the Jewish people to be citizens of Rome, not worship the gods of the Roman Empire, and pay their taxes. And they would, as long as they paid their taxes and were good citizens, weren't trying to uprise like the Maccabees, they were just letting them do their thing. And so the Jewish people saw that the Christians were becoming a force within the community, and so they tried to go get the Romans to help persecute them. And we see this, when Jesus is brought before Pontius Pilate. But it's also seen later on, even after Jesus' death in Acts 18:14 through 15, which,
But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things."
So I found it really interesting that, like some people will say, the Bible can't be verified against history and anything like that. But Galileo, there's actual Roman documents that show that he was a Roman judge. He was real. We know Paul was brought before him, and both in the New Testament and in Roman, pagan documents, it verifies that did happen. He did not do anything against the Roman Empire that was like a crime. It was an internal Jewish document. And so that's why, the Jews were the ones persecuting the Christians, because they couldn't get the Romans to do it for them. That all turned around when Nero, in 64 AD, he actually came to power in 54 AD. We all know Nero. Some people think he was crazy. There's some credence that he was just a politician. And he was a very crafty politician. He came to power in 54 AD, and then a big fire broke out in Rome in 64. It lasted anywhere between 7 and 9 days. They do believe it was probably an accident in an olive oil factory that started it. But it was really interesting that there were two areas of the city that were not really affected, and that was the Christian and the Jewish quarters. And so, knowing what we just learned about how the Jews were accepted by the Romans because they were good citizens and paying taxes, Nero used as an opportunity, one, to make himself more popular and to take some of the heat off of him, because there was actually a rumor going around in Rome that he had set the fire. But he was like probably several miles away when the fire actually started. So it's a little convoluted, it's history. But he used that as an opportunity to go after the Christians. And that's when, in 64 AD, so about 30 years after Jesus' death, that's when the Roman Empire started the persecution of Christians. And it was only in Rome at that time. But he persecuted them pretty horribly. Some little ways he would do it, he dressed them in furs, he put them in a circus, and he would allow animals to chase after him. Like it was like he put them in bear skins, and a lion would eat them. He would also take Christians and put them on a pole, tie them to the pole, and set them on fire in his gardens, so he could invite people over and to his gardens at night, and they could walk through the gardens with light, and there were Christians burning. He was pretty evil the way he did it, but it helped his popularity within the Roman Empire. Like we said, we talked about how they would try to say that Christians are cannibalistic because we use symbology, but they would say that we're actually eating flesh of Jesus. I don't know why people thought that the flesh of Jesus would still be around 30 years after his death, but that's what they would use. And so initially the persecution began as charges of arson against Christians, and then it just turned into, hey, you're a Christian, I don't care, we don't care we're not even levy a charge against you. It's just you're going to be a Christian. And so, for 4 years, he persecuted Christians heavily until 68 AD when he was overthrown by the Senate, I believe, and he killed himself.
Yeah. So the rumors that were started against Christians were incredibly vicious. Of course, when Jesus talks about, eating his flesh and drinking his blood, which, the Roman Catholics would take to be literal, and that's a long discussion, of course, but we believe it's just like when he says, I am the vine, or I am the door. He means something, there's something real there, but he's not speaking as woodenly and literally. But that actually, when they accused Christians of cannibalism, there's an early document, I think it's either Irenaeus or Justin Martyr that writes about this, but there's a rumor that was started. Let me see if there's children in here. Okay, it's just gruesome. I mean, it's just gruesome. Like, there was a rumor that was started that, and I think it's Justin that writes against this, that they would put an infant inside of a big loaf of bread and, cut through the bread, kill the infant, and then all just go into this frenzy of cannibalism, which of course was not true, even in the least. But that's the sort of rumor that was started against Christians. They were called atheists because they wouldn't worship the gods. They were called cannibals because, of that. And so there are all kinds of, false news spread against believers. And so, but then, last thing I'll say, I hope probably this class, but when you're talking about the garden parties that Nero had, can you imagine evangelizing somebody back then? Come and believe the gospel. You might end up burning in Nero's garden, but you'll have eternal life. Like, the call to be a Christian was so serious back then. And today it's just like, we'll just pray a sinner's prayer and everything will be fine.
And it's still spread like wildfire.
And it's still spread like wildfire, yes.
But it was really interesting, though, that I always thought that it was like a whole Roman Empire thing early on of persecution of Christians. It was very localized in the beginning. Up until, even the first 100, from 30 AD to 100 AD, it was very localized. Like I said, Nero targeted Christians in Rome. He wasn't going to Israel and taking them out. Go ahead, Walt.
I was going to say what Pastor brought out about what the Christians were accused of, and it just goes to show you that fake news has been around for a long time.
Very true.
And it's just used as a political weapon against the opponent, and it comes in all shapes and sizes, and it doesn't matter. The more corrupt a society is you can imagine, or corrupt the leadership is, you can imagine the extrapolation of how much fake news there is. I mean, it's just, look at this as an example of how horrible the Christians were treated because they created a fake narrative for people to believe.
And might I say, this is from the society where it was legal to expose your infant up to 2 years old to die. Mm-hmm. You could put your infant out, so they pretend moral outrage, for something that they themselves do legally. Anyway, nothing changes, does it?
I just wanted to comment and say that, the paradox of the goodness of God is that the church seems to grow exponentially when there is suffering, when there's persecution going on. Yeah. And again, I give God.
Well, strong churches.
Becomes stronger and resilient, and it grows during persecution.
I think biblical churches. So I don't think, I'm going to take a dig at Joel Osteen, but I don't think his church would last very long if this persecution would start, because he's not, centered on the Bible. And so, I agree 100%. But the early church Christians were so immersed in the Word. Like we talked yesterday, they would hear like a letter from Paul be read to their church in like a thesis, and then they would hear one word missed, and they would have a debate and a confrontation about it with the person reading it to make sure that word was there. I mean, they weren't reading it; they were hearing it, and that's how strong they were in their faith. They knew the words word by word by word, and so that is a strong conviction, and I think it led to the martyrs and what they would say in the arenas and when they were being tortured to death. And in fact, in the books, there are multiple accounts of like people coming to get arrested, and the bishop, I think Ignatius was the guy that we'll talk about here shortly, but he actually prayed with the people that came to arrest him, and they came to faith while arresting Ignatius. There's another one that I was just trying to look through it. When James the Great under Nero was put to death, his executioner heard the prayer and pretty much said, I come to faith, you can't chop his head off without two people. And he had his head cut off with James the Great.
Wow.
Like he came to faith and died right at the same moment as James. And so like that power is just looking at that is like, wow, those people have amazing faith. And too, like, thankfully at this point in our history, we don't have to worry about having our heads cut off for being like we are today. So it takes a little bit of anxiety, from me at least, know that what people have gone through. But after Nero's death, there's a period of turmoil within the Roman governance. There are a couple of emperors that came about, and then in about 100 AD, they came together. The Romans started truly having like an actual law that said, hey, we need to get rid of these Christians. And it was because they weren't worshiping the emperor, they weren't worshiping the gods, and more importantly, they were no longer considered a sect of the Jews. So after they fell out of that sect of the Jews, the Romans decided, hey, we can now start persecuting them. We'll leave the Jews alone because they're still good citizens, and we'll let them worship how they worship. But these Christians, they're not part of the Jewish community anymore. They're a whole new religion, and we got to stamp it out. So that's when they started the persecutions. And it started as early as 107 AD, and it was Ignatius. He was a bishop in Antioch. He was about 70 years old, and there's not a lot known about his death or his accuser, but he was accused by someone of being a Christian. And they weren't going around the churches and pulling people out and killing them. You had to have an accuser. So it's sort of like they're using the law to persecute Christians. So I would have to accuse Walt of being a Christian. The Romans would come and arrest him, and then he would stand trial. Go ahead, Amy.
Was there any benefit to the accuser?
I didn't really read anything, but
It's just like, why would you do that?
I think early on what would happen is from what I can gather from the book, it's not really clear, but it would seem like someone would have a beef with someone, and I would see this when I was in Afghanistan. Like we would come in, install our legal system in Afghanistan when we were there, and like someone would accuse someone else of being Taliban, and we would go target them. But this guy over here, he's getting a benefit. Like we're taking out a competitor, or we're taking out someone who they don't like, and now they can use it for their personal gain. And so I think that's what happened with Ignatius. But the really cool thing is on his travels to Rome, he wrote 7 letters, and one of them was to Polycarp, who is the second martyr that we'll talk about. So I'm pretty close to finishing up. He wrote 7 letters, and it's really interesting. He was he would meet Christians along the route, so it wasn't like a true, like how I think a lot of Christians think they were being persecuted, like they had to hide, like in China, churches have to hide in China because they'll just come arrest everybody out of that church. But it was more of like you had to be an accuser, and all along the route he was writing letters back to Antioch, back to other churches. He was writing to Polycarp, and he would give them to Christians along the route, and they would come in and see him and everything like that. But he was taken to Rome to be put to death. I think it was just the emperor liked to see Christians die. But the really interesting, and we don't know much about his death and how he was put to death, but he found out that he was about to be freed. And he said, "Do not free me. I want to die." And he refused to be saved. And so he could have easily been saved, and he was put to death, which I found to be really interesting. And he's a really, I could read a lot of his letters, but it's really interesting how he said in his letter, he said, I no longer savor corruptible food, but I wish to taste the bread of God, which is the flesh of Jesus, and his blood I wish to drink, which is an immortal drink. When I suffer, I shall be free in Jesus Christ, and with him shall rise again in freedom. And that was from his last letter. So that's why he was so convicted, and he so believed that he was like, why do I want to stay here anymore? And then Polycarp is the second. I think some people have heard of him. I've heard of him. I didn't know anything about him. He was an understudy of Ignatius. And one of the 7 letters on his travels back to Rome was written to him. He was in Smyrna. So he learned underneath Ignatius. He was a bishop. So think about it. In 50 years, we had bishops and within the Catholic, or in the, I think Catholics, like your bishops, but in the Christian community. He was a bishop in Smyrna. And in 155 AD, he was actually accused of a crime and brought to trial. And he's got some interesting things in his trial that. So the proconsul, who's the judge, tried to get him to worship the emperor, and Polycarp refused. And the judge ordered him to cry, "Out with the atheists!" And Polycarp looked at the crowd and said, "Yes, out with the atheists." And he was pointing at everybody in the crowd. And that, obviously that probably made the judge mad. And the judge tried again because, Polycarp, I think, was about 80 at this time. He didn't really want to put him to death. And the judge said, "Hey, if you just swear loyalty to the emperor and worship the emperor, I will let you go." And he said, "For 86 years I have served him," as in Jesus Christ, "and he has done me no evil. How could I curse my king who has saved me?" The dialogue kept going on like that, back and forth, and the judge threatened him with being burned alive. So could you imagine being like, "I'm going to sentence you to being burned alive"? And he told the judge that fire could only light for a moment, whereas the eternal fire will never go out. And finally, when he was put on the pyre to be burned to death, he prayed out loud, "Lord, sovereign God, I thank you that you deem me worthy of this moment, so that jointly with your martyrs I may have a share in the cup of Christ. For this I bless and glorify you. Amen." And this is actually verified by Tacitus, who was a Roman historian and a pagan. So not only, it was actually verified that he said these things. So there are lots of martyrs throughout this time. And as we finish up, everybody's heard of Marcus Aurelius. I know he's becoming popular in a lot of American studies with his Meditations book. Everybody thinks he's this wonderful human, but he was a very smart, cunning politician. And he wrote the book, and but he didn't really persecute the Christians, but he didn't not persecute the Christians. He just let it go, even though he was smart. And he even said that Christians make the best citizens of the Roman Empire. They're the best citizens. They're the best people. The only thing that he continued to persecute them was because they would not worship their gods. And I think it was probably political. He was just, continuing on with the previous trends. So we got to the 2nd century, 200 AD. Christianity is spread, but it's under attack. And, I think it's probably worse having sporadic persecution, it moves from city to city in time and place. It changes with politicians rather than, just knowing that if we get together, we're all going to get persecuted. It would be sort of like who's in the crowd. And it's amazing to know and see how Christianity, continued to spread even more rapidly, even after 200 AD, with that persecution going on.
I'm just going to add that, when you were talking about Christians being persecuted and different people that had died a martyr's death, we had read not long ago that a lot of the people who were martyred, even in the Middle Ages and a little beyond then, they were up until several hundred years ago, they were given, the public was given a different story. They were political opponents of the church and or, the Anglican Church or the Crown. And so therefore, because they wouldn't submit, or they continued to preach, or they didn't go follow the Anglican tradition or whatever, or the Catholic tradition, they were persecuted and burned alive or whatever. But the public, the general public, was given a different story. They were insurrectionists, or they were
that's throughout history.
So yeah,
anytime a king wants to be worshipped as a king, they would use that as a charge against Christianity and Christians. In this book, it goes all the way up. I mean, you can read about martyrs all the way up to 1820. So not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. It seems like a long time to us. But I just found it interesting about how, we have a tendency to think that, this is the worst time in America for Christians and, it's so horrible. Yet we forget about the freedoms that we do have. And by looking back at history, you can see that, the people that gave us, that went before us had it way worse and unimaginably worse. Being burned alive, being pulled apart, being stoned to death. They would come up with creative ways to kill Christians, and it was a gain to them. And just that, knowing that, is comforting to me to know that we are free to worship in America. And so I hope the class was interesting and made sense. So I appreciate you all giving me an opportunity. Thank you, Pastor Philip. And,
Thank you.
Let me close this in prayer and give us some time. Dear God, we want to thank you for the martyrs and the leaders that came before us and spread your word and continue with your mission, and help us remember that part of your calling is for us to evangelize, and how the ones that came before us were not afraid to evangelize even at the threat of death. And help us, give us that strength to spread your good word to those that need to hear it, and to continue your calling to us. And we just ask that you help Pastor Philip today preach the word as you wish him to preach the word, and allow us to hear what you need us to hear this morning. And we just ask to have everyone have a blessed week. And we just thank you for the opportunity to come together today and worship you and give you thanks. And it's in your Son's name, Jesus, in which we pray.
There's some